My name is Eamon O'Byrne. I'm the Executive Director of the Sonoma Land Trust, and I will be your host for this evening. As usual, before I introduce our very special guest, I have some housekeeping to take care of. This presentation is being interpreted in Spanish. Click on the world icon at the bottom right of your screen if you'd like to access it. If you're on a phone, click on the three dots and choose your language. And I'll just take a few minutes for Mariana to give those instructions in Spanish.
Hola, gracias, Eamon. Esta reunión, se está grabando en español y se está haciendo intérprete simultáneo en español. Pueden hacerlo seleccionando un icono que tiene un globo, y si están en sus teléfonos, si no, pueden hacerlo donde hay 3 puntitos en la parte de abajo. Thank you, Eamon.
Gracias, Mariana. So this presentation is scheduled for about an hour, which will be followed by approximately 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions for Doug, and I'm sure you do, you can submit your questions in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A, and we'll be keeping an eye on those and queuing them up for Doug. So Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit that acquires land to protect the plants, animals, and landscapes of Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976, and we've protected more than 56,000 acres in our county so far. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members and contributors. So thanks to all of you out there who are helping us to protect this beautiful county we call Sonoma for both communities now and for future generations. As we pursue our mission of conserving land in Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. We honor their knowledge, their care, and their stewardship of this special place across the ages, and acknowledge the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted on them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. So I'm often asked, besides supporting organizations like the Land Trust, what else can a person do to protect and enhance the diversity of plants and animals in their daily lives? To help answer that question, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of my heroes, Doug Tallamy. Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 105 research articles and taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses for 41 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways that insects interact with plants and how such actions determine the diversity of animal communities. Doug's first book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. His second book, Nature's Best Hope, A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard, was published in 2020 and made the New York Times bestseller list. His latest book, published in 2021, is The Nature of Oaks, the rich ecology of our most essential trees. And now, without any more delay, it's over to you, Doug.
Well, thank you very much, Eamon. If you bring nature home, you really are nature's best hope. So that's what I want to expand on tonight. But before I do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. Edwardo Wilson, of course, a Harvard scholar for many, many years, one of the most accomplished scientists of all times. But one of the things that was, he died the day after Christmas is where I was going with that. And it's a terrible loss to the world of conservation, to many worlds. But one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his effort to save life on planet Earth. He loved biodiversity. He knew that we absolutely needed it. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. It was the culmination of his lifelong efforts to save the living aspects of our planet. Well, he had one comment or one very simple message with this book, and that was if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time talking about how we could actually go about doing that. Of course, to conservation biologists, putting aside half the Earth sounds like a wonderful idea. We'll just put aside half the Earth for nature and everything will be great. The problem is half of planet Earth, terrestrial Earth anyway, is in some form of agriculture at this point. And we've got 8 billion people in all of our detritus and roadways and airports and so on in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for the natural world. So a lot of people are wondering, how can we possibly do what E.O. Wilson wants us to do? That's what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize E.O.'s dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we do that, I want to talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019, I guess it was. We had a very large oak mast. Members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through that hole, then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally, it plopped down. That's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays in that chamber as a pupa underground for 2 years. After 2 years comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if the weevils came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, something like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils. And after the acorn has left after the weevil has left the acorn, it leaves a hole, and scouts often find those holes in new acorns and they get very excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the larvae, it's time to move the eggs. They move the entire colony into the new hole in the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here to make sure that nobody else comes in that hole. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap that acorn below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back and get it in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. The specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have the beloved E. marginia unless you have mistletoe, which is it's a parasite on our oak trees, but it doesn't really hurt them. That is the only plant that beautiful moth can develop on. You won't have 60 species of native California bees unless you have the pollen from sunflower. We have over 4,000 species of bees in this country, and over a third of them are specialized on particular pollens. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So I could talk all day, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships. The point I want to make tonight, though, is that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. But we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need to keep us alive on planet Earth. You might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this, and I don't know, but I suspect that we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever, and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty serious headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's just about 1/3 of our North American bird population already gone. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago, so maybe it's the next 18 years. Makes a nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. We have to make sure this does not happen because these are the species that keep us alive. This is important stuff. I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, this upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. But those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food beds would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we need, like produce oxygen, like cleaner water, and slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, like carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra tissues into the ground through their root system. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put there over the eons. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, they convert sunlight into food. If we were to lose our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight. That'll be hard. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but these are really important here. They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystems, that destroy ecosystem services, is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before because we've got more people demanding them. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can. but it's not good enough. And that's why we are in the 6th great extinction event that the Earth has ever experienced, which means we're going to have to start to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. And there have been indigenous groups who've been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do it gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, unfortunately, that he might not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue tonight, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservation has worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that is pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, we can't ignore private property because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 52% of California is privately owned, which is one of the lowest percentages in the country, but it's still a lot of land. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the term conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there for sure. But we really have to start putting back together again all those areas where we've destroyed the natural world. And that's really a form of restoration. Before you tell me that, well, you're never going to put it back exactly the way it was, I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to create functional ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was at that place at some point in the past. It can still function as a workable ecosystem. But in order to do that, we need to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we're going to have to start with the building blocks. And there's two groups that we cannot do without: the flowering plants and those pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing energy from the sun and converting it through photosynthesis into food that drives just about all of the food webs on planet Earth. So now we have the food locked up in plant tissues, largely leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, we don't have any animals. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants, and most of those invertebrates are insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, they're going to be failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the bird that's at our feeders all winter long. All the types of chickadees are at our feeders all winter long. They're practically the same bird doing the same thing. Because they're at our feeders in the wintertime, eating seed, we think that's what chickadees need. Well, 50% of their diet during the wintertime is seeds, but the other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time for them to reproduce in the springtime, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch entirely to invertebrates. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, this is a citizen science project that one of my students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. This is just one of the lines of evidence that suggests it. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. And they were supposed to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items in the beaks of these birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And it was very successful. She got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. You're looking at a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets in the 20 most common bird families that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families in North America, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. So the birds don't want a lot of chitin. And because they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have a lot of sharp edges too. Then finally, it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among invertebrate prey items. These first two bars are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts for most bird diets. They're essential. So let's generalize. Let's say most birds require caterpillars. So the next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Well, that's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get that nest of chicks to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's able to count them. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one clutch of a nest of bird that is 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, or any of the small birds around to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not produce all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major sources of the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's a Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups. The species that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the birds that do not require insects. So things like finches and doves can actually produce a little milk out of seeds they eat and feed that to their young. And look, the birds that did not require insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that do require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need a new goal when we're thinking about landscaping. In the past, we've had one goal, and that's to make our landscapes pretty. We can keep that goal, but we need to expand it. We need to make landscapes that are pretty, but also ecologically functional. And we're not going to be able to do that unless we add caterpillars to the landscapes. How do you do that? You add the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars, which means we have to be fussy about it. We have to choose the plants that do support a lot of caterpillars, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. The monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the eucalyptus and all the crepe myrtle and all of the plants from Asia that we typically landscape with, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plant lineages for which they've developed adaptations. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and convert it to food for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects eat just like they can only eat plant lineages that they have those specialized adaptations for that circumvent, that get around those chemical defenses. Insects develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. And when they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So you can take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with any of the non-native plants that we landscape with. And the monarch, that gives the monarch two choices. It can fly away and find milkweed someplace else or starve to death. It turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. There's plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There's plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there's plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. One of our oaks is a great example of a contributor. Oaks across the country contribute more energy than any other type of plant. A ginkgo biloba from Asia, or eucalyptus, good examples of plants that do not contribute to food webs. Nothing can eat a ginkgo. So it's there, it's taking up space, but it's not contributing energy. And a plant that degrades a local food web would be any of our invasive species, the plants that escape cultivation. In the east here, we have calorie pear, terrible invasive. It escapes, and pretty soon every place around you looks like calorie pear. So it doesn't contribute energy, and it does replace the plants that do. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we don't pick the right plants that actually build food webs, we're not going to be able to restore ecosystem function. We're not going to be able to restore nature. And I'm going to give you three examples of how well it works when we do pick the right plants, starting with my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife and I moved in the year 2000. It was a farm. It was broken up into 10-acre lots. Very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. The soil was totally exhausted. Last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there weren't very many plants there. We wanted to restore ecosystem function. Well, the best way to do that is put the caterpillars back. So I started with the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet, but I wanted to see if I could get one to live at our property. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you don't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. They are specialists on meadow rue, just like the Monarch is a specialist on milkweed. Canadian owlets specialize in meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. So I got some meadow rue seed from someplace and I planted it. And this was early on. I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow rue. There's no meadow rue anywhere around us. So I didn't even go out and check it after I planted it for about 2 months. And then I was walking by for some other reason. I looked over and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That beautiful moth. It's actually a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away, so I planted some. They grew very nicely, but it took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens. They finally did. Now we have a good population of both of them. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor at our property, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be at our house. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted several hackberry trees. We had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did. And now we've got good populations of them. So now we've added 6 species. And that's how the restoration has proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. I planted Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover, makes valuable nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. They're high in fat, and that's what migrating birds need. It's a good pollinator plant. The flowers are tiny and inconspicuous. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this cloud of native bees around it. You remember, when you're planting a pollinator garden, you're planting for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets, an important bird in the East. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. But we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth came, spends his day with his head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. Sometimes it's there alone, and I planted, this is something you guys can get, the Pacific green sphinx moth. It's on evening primrose as well. This is on my bucket list. I'd love to see one of these. So plant your evening primrose and this guy will come. I planted lots of oaks as well. And those are just examples of things that we put back in our yard. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart Lamb. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say all the time, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local ecosystem, if you can enjoy the energy it's contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to attract the moths that created the caterpillars that ran the food web that attract all kinds of other things to our yard. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's Promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted Oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique Excuse me, it makes me sneeze. The oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support local wildlife. It'll do it the very first year. So what our yard looks like today, I'm just trying to convince you we put a lot of plants back. I keep adding plants. So, there's still a lot of species that are missing, but our research has shown that you can quantify or estimate how productive and how stable your food web is simply by counting the number of moth species, not butterflies, but moths that are in your local food web. So 5 years ago, I took on the big job of trying to photograph every single moth that has now started to make a living at our house. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,192 species that I've recorded so far at our house. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we're supporting 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that the Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by 2/3, by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. Imagine what we could do if everybody put the plants back. We can turn these terrible statistics around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres, and a lot of people have less land than that. Can this work on smaller properties, particularly in suburbia? Well, that is a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors have the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. So they got rid of that. That's an invasive from Asia. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they were up to 149 bird species so far, including 35 warbler species. If you're a birder, you know that's a very good number. Just to put that in perspective, at our house with 10 acres, we've only recorded 8 warbler species so far. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, she is right next to O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller lot size than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre because Pam is a native plant landscaper. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature, and then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine, and started to count all the birds that are using her yards. And she's up to 124 species so far, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. There it is. Okay, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of them has to be reducing the area that we have in lawn in this country. I know you Californians are not guilty of these giant lawns, or at least not anymore. But much of the rest of the country is. We have, at this point, 44 million acres of lawn dedicated to an ecological deadscape. That's an area bigger than New England. Now I know I know why. It's a status symbol. So we need our status symbols, and we also need areas to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that's in lawn? What if we took areas like this and we started to put the plants back, like Dan Getman has done? He sent me this picture from Missouri. This is the 2nd year of his planning. He said, "Look, I'm doing it." Well, if everybody did that, that would give us 20 million acres we could put towards conservation, and we could create a new national park. If we did it at home, I'm calling it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? You get the opportunity to create or establish a personal relationship with Mother Nature. Maybe you're going to rekindle one you had as a child. Maybe you're going to have one for the first time in your life. And you can do it at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. Or you maybe all you have to do is look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people did that last year. So you know what you're going to see, lots of people. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think that is essential if you're going to develop that personal relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And it's really important for our poor kids. Our kids, Richard Liu says they're suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, they drive for an hour to a natural area, they walk around, the teacher tells them not to touch anything, then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing, but it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and become friends with it, get to know with it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. You know, when we hover over our kids, we're sending the message, it's a subliminal message that whatever you're doing is dangerous. You need parents around there to protect you. We don't want to tell our kids that nature is dangerous. We don't want to make them afraid of it. Our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And if they're afraid of being a steward, if they don't know they're the future stewards, if they don't know how to be a steward of the planet, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature, a little piece of grass with a hedge. But there are anola lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture. This is how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you crawl towards the lizard. You sneak up on it. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of it. You fall in love with it. You become a good steward of that lizard. No, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground the rest of her life, catching lizards with her best dress on. I don't think. She sent me this picture, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet, in part because of these experiences. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinicy's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, and please do, go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. It is free. What you're doing is joining a national movement to make conservation part of our culture. You're going to record where your property is, the location, and the amount of land that you are being a good steward of. If you really do get rid of that patch of lawn, you put that area in. If you put in good xeric planting, if you maybe you're protecting a little patch of chaparral on your property, anything that you do like that. Maybe you put just a milkweed in a flower pot for the monarchs when they fly by. All of that can go on the map. And then your little piece of your county is going to light up. And the object is get the whole country to light up, to see where the gaps are, see where we need to get more people interested, build biological corridors. We're as much trying to change the culture as we are trying to actually save land. We've got about 10,000 people on the map so far. I'll be happy when we have 10 million, 100 million. We need everybody to join this united effort to turn around our biodiversity crisis. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? Well, I'm going to argue that some of them have to be keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the arch, the Roman arch. If you take it out of the Roman arch, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of our local food webs, the food webs collapse because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants, the keystone plants, are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold up that house. They're the support. They're the ones making all the food. We cannot build a house out of wallpaper. It won't work. You're not through building your house after you put up your keystone plants, but it is an essential start. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are. But there are a lot of natives that don't contribute all that much either. So really the question is, do we want to put the most contributors in there, the most powerful natives that support the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? What supports more keystone or what keystone plant supports more caterpillars than any other in the entire country? It's one of our oaks. Where I live in the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant that comes close to that. And I believe California has 38 species of oaks. You're doing really well with your oaks. If you want to know the best keystone plants, the most powerful plants where you live, there's two things you can do. You can go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, but you Californians have made a better tool, CalScape, from the California Native Plant Society. Go there, and every single native plant in California is geo-referenced. You can look and see exactly what occurs right where you live. Here are the top ranked plants generally in many species or many areas of California. But this is the best type of tool. It'll tell you exactly what to plant wherever you live. So we're going to put in, we're going to reduce the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research showing that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects at night, particularly those moths that create the caterpillars that run our food webs. Believe it or not, this is good news to me. We have to turn around insect declines, not just stop it. We've got to turn it around and rebuild insect populations. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There's a lot of switches we've got to flick, but we can become good switch flickers. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn off the light over my front porch or my garage or my barn because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns off or only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is best. They're not expensive. You can get them in lots of hardware stores. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we could save millions of insects and millions of dollars too if we use LEDs. All right, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows all those caterpillars on our trees to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Now, this is just an example, but I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the tree, eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches of the tree. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. But most species don't do that. 94% of them finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree. And they wiggle their way beneath the soil if the ground isn't too compacted and pupate underground. Or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soils to the point where they're rock hard, which means the way we landscape across most of the country becomes an ecological trap. Moths come in, lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, they drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape is not the solution either. Now, this is what most people do. They have a tree in a lawn. I've got a new grad student this year who is starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. Maybe a native dogwood here, you got a tree, and then an azalea, ferns, ground cover. It's a soft landing. The caterpillar drops down. It's not compacted. Nobody's going to step on it. Nobody's going to mow it. Plenty of leaf litter to spin their cocoon in. Survivorship will be much higher. Great place to do spring ephemeral gardening where that's appropriate. This is how you shrink the lawn, folks. You put in plants underneath your trees. Yerba buena is a great ground cover that you can have under your trees, and a great place for those moths to be able to pupate. Grad student Desiree Narango, former grad student, did great work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and the results of her study suggest that there is room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news to me. She had one simple question, and that is, how well do chickadee populations do in landscapes, in suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus suburban landscapes dominated by typical introduced ornamentals? And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they support 75% fewer caterpillars. So they reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, every yard had a nest box up in it, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to mature. And if you put all that in a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plants in the landscape, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We focused on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. This is replacement rate. This dotted line is replacement rate. It's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you breed at that level, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population, anything above the line here. And that happens when you have very few non-native plants in your yard. But if you have a lot of non-native plants in your yard, you have an unsustainable shrinking population. You're not making enough babies to replace the adults that die every year. Now, right here is where those lines intersect, liberally speaking. So it suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Now, none of them can be invasive. We can't tolerate invasive species because they're ecological tumors, but there's a lot of non-native plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman's picture here? This is a ginkgo biloba from Asia. What's it doing in his native plant landscape? Well, his wife likes ginkgos, so she asked him to put one in. He did. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No. Is it invasive? Is it spreading? No. It's kind of inert, just sitting there. I like to think of them as if it's a statue. So there you go. It's a statue. But how many statues do you want in your yard? A few are okay, but if it's nothing but statues, you're not going to have a functional ecosystem. It is not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those real contributors, those keystone native plants that are supporting most of the food. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design she sent me a couple of years ago. You don't get more formal than that. And every single plant in that landscape is a native plant. This was taken by a drone 400 feet up. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. But I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It convinces your neighbor that this is intentional. It's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of a number of pollinators. Now, it's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. And remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time it's because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's really about a 1/12 of our crops. But I hear people say, oh, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the agriculture argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this? California lilac, wonderful pollinator plant. It's beautiful. It does everything that we need. This is in Kathy Kramer's yard, any of our asters, wonderful pollinator plants. This is a Drew Latham design in the east. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. More and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program where the state is helping homeowners convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's a very popular program. There's an island off Florida that's paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on them. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. $100 coupons from utilities, public utilities, to convince people to put in water efficient native species instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, those great lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California. And by the way, this has gone up. You now get a $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. You Californians don't have one drop of rain to waste on unproductive lawn. And if you want to know more about those different programs, memorize that. All right, we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. At least I think we have. And the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. We like to visit it. It's entertaining, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, then when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And of course, resources are always in short supply. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. These are beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that nature is enormously entertaining, but it's more important than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about that, but if we restrict our conservation efforts just to areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small and too isolated. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we have to put the plants back, folks. We got to glue our rug back together again, not just to make biological corridors between viable habitat, but to recreate viable habitat where we've destroyed it. It's starting to happen. And when we're finished putting those plants back, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I don't know why. Because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody be responsible for taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You were not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, so many people feel absolutely powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can turn out their lights or put in a yellow bulb. One person can remove the invasive plants that are already on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can use keystone plants. Did I say that? One person can totally revitalize ecosystem function on their piece of the earth, and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continue to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park, help a preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Well, gosh, Doug, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think you can hear from where you are the incredibly loud applause that's drifting your way. Really appreciate your thoughts and your advice and your guidance. And we'll get going on the Q&A session in just a second. But to just to let everybody know, for those who have to leave right now, to follow up on Doug's call to action, keep engaged with the Land Trust by following our various social media accounts or visiting our website. Attendees can view past presentations and this one, thanks to Doug's generosity, and download educational materials at our Nature at Home page on our website, SonomaLandTrust.org, Nature at Home. Keep an eye out for our monthly Language of the Land webinars. Sonoma Land Trust is a nonprofit organization, which means we rely on the donations from individuals, businesses, and foundations to make our work possible. If you like what you've heard today, please consider donating, whether to us or whether to Doug's wonderful organization. Your gift helps support land protection and preservation. To make a donation online to the Sonoma Land Trust, visit SonomaLandTrust.org and click the donate button. And I think, Doug, the website for your organization is again?
Homegrownnationalpark.org.
Thanks again. And Doug, if you can hang around for just a few more minutes just to answer some of the questions that have come up. One of the questions that's come up again, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind doing this, but could you go back to the slide that has the CalScape information on it? We just have had a flurry of folks saying, oh, we really want to see that right now, even though it's going to be on our website.
Okay, not that far back. It really is a wonderful tool. I wish every state had one.
And while Doug is getting, oh, there we go. So
these numbers here are for the San Francisco area. So it's going to vary as you move around the state a little bit.
Another question that came up for us, and I think this would apply to a lot of folks out here in Northern California. But a lot of folks grow vegetables and fruit trees just because of our wonderful climate. And there's a question, you know, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but have you seen any research that shows how introducing native plants hurts or helps food production in a backyard situation?
Yeah. Well, what you're trying to do, I mean, you know, when you're growing fruit trees, typically you have to spray them all the time. If you're trying to do it organically, though, you're trying to do it without spraying, then you want as many natural enemies around that are going to control the things that attack that fruit. And that's where the native plants would come in a very important way. So let me give you an example. In the East here, a lot of people grow tomatoes. I guess you do too, but we have the tobacco hornworm, which gets on those tomatoes. It's a type of sphinx moth, but there is a little wasp, a braconid wasp that lays its eggs in the caterpillar, and then all kinds of I mean, there are hundreds of little wasps that develop inside that caterpillar. Then they tunnel out through the exoskeleton and make these little cocoons on the back of the tobacco hornworm. People think they're eggs, but those are actually the pupating wasps that have been in that caterpillar. Well, what you want is a lot of those braconid wasps around when the tobacco hornworm comes to your tomato plant. I have 17 species of sphinx moths at my house, and all of them are attacked by that braconid wasp. So if I plant tomatoes and I get the tobacco hornworm, there's plenty of those wasps around that will attack it right away. If I had no other sphinx moths around, there wouldn't be any braconid wasps around, and the tobacco hornworm would go crazy. So that's the idea with having native plants around that keep natural enemies around that can help control the pests on your gardens or your fruit trees. That's the best way that they could help those plantings.
Another question that's come up, and I'll try to help answer this question, but it's about the particular circumstances that we find ourselves in Sonoma County with very high fire risk. And, you know, how do we balance growing and creating a native plant habitat with protecting, you know, for most of us, our most important investment in life, our home? And so I can answer part of that by saying, you know, clearly you want to follow the advice of local fire districts and keep most of your tree cover and shrub-like bushes away from, you know, buildings and such like. But I think it's also important to remember that most of the plants that we're recommending are pretty drought tolerant. And for the most part, our water stores or that they go dormant. They're less likely to be a fire risk if they're existing in a home situation where you are regularly either managing them or pruning them or keeping them at a length that prevents them from becoming simply endless fuel buildups. Unlike natural spaces where shrubby type plants, because we don't manage our landscapes and because we've taken fire off the land, those species have gotten out of balance. But in a homegrown environment, we have the ability to keep that balance so that we're not building up what we call fine fuel loads. The other, I think, thing to remember too from a fire perspective is that the worst and the most dangerous sorts of fires occur because fires crown. Again, what Doug is recommending is not planting a tree right next to your property or your home, but giving it that distance so the fire has nowhere to go except down to the ground where firefighters can take care of it. So there is a way through good property management to both have a native garden plus ensure that it's safe from, it doesn't create a greater fire risk. So Doug, anything that you would like to share with us in terms of, you know, managing that space? What have you learned about managing that space? And, you know, the importance for, you know, not just taking a step back and letting it grow. It just doesn't work like that.
Right. Well, I think you covered it pretty well. One thing I'll add is that your native oaks, particularly your live oaks, are great interceptors of those flying embers. They don't burst into flame. And by the way, eucalyptus does. You don't want any eucalyptus around if you're worried about fire. But people say, I don't want big trees because they're all going to burn up. But oaks are a great way to, if you have a crown fire and those embers are blowing for, you know, a long, long way, the oaks can actually intercept them and keep them off your house. It turns out in so many places in California, the most flammable thing in these fires is your house. It's not the plants around the house. So building your house out of fire retardant material is also a wonderful way to you know, tone things down. But I'm always pushing the use of oaks, and as a fire management tool, it's a great plant.
We also have someone on our chat who's referring folks to the Resilient Landscape Coalition of Sonoma, the UC Master Gardeners, Ecology Center and Habitat Project. Apparently there you'll find resources on recommended native plants and science-based fire-wise landscaping. Thank you, Cleo, for that piece of information. We have a question here, and I think this gets to the biology of the different parts of the country. What are California ecosystems, Doug, as rich in caterpillar species as the East Coast? We tend not to see them a lot in our native landscapes.
You know, you don't see them a lot in our landscapes either, because they don't want to be seen. The birds are excellent at finding them, so they're very cryptic. Many of the caterpillars are only active at night. So if you are looking for caterpillars, go out with a flashlight at night when they are out exposed. The birds are not hunting at night. And during the day, they are doing their very best to hide from you. Some of them will actually crawl off the tree, or they look just like leaf diseases or just like bark. They're extremely good at hiding. You have a greater plant diversity than we have. So when you add up all the caterpillars, you have a much greater number of caterpillars than we do. Sometimes our caterpillar densities are higher. We have the deciduous spring flush of leaves in the spring that is not as common in the dry areas of the West. And there's a lot of caterpillar biomass that tracks that. But, you know, if you're counting species, you've got more caterpillars than we do.
Folks have asked, you know, what besides the oak tree is a keystone plant for the San Francisco Bay Area? What native plants grow well in the fog would feed the birds too? That's a great question, and I think you'd probably find the right answers at Calscape as well as other resources. I do know from personal experience that there's lots of native plants that grow well in fog. But I think one of the things that Doug has underlined is that not all native species will support caterpillar and other types of food webs. I know from my own experience in the windy part of the western part of San Francisco that the California ironwood and the wax myrtle really love that fog. But I don't think they are particularly effective for caterpillars. But that's something we should look up. We have some other questions here, and Doug, you're going to say something.
Well, you have a number of species of ceanothus, and they are great caterpillar plants. Your cottonwoods are great caterpillar plants, so those would be top ranked. In addition to the oaks.
The other, a couple of questions have come up about, oh gosh, I have things like birches or black locust or other things, and should I be cutting them down and removing them?
You know, those are plants from the East. I've been to San Francisco. Most of your big trees are plants from the East, which of course require watering. So that's not good, but Should you be cutting them down? You know, this is a judgment call. If they're not going to support anything. So we did a study comparing red oaks in Portland, Oregon with red oaks where they belong in the East. The red oaks in Portland, Oregon don't have anything on. The red oaks in the East are, you know, one of the most productive plants that we have. So you're planting these plants outside of their ecological productive zone. I wouldn't just go out with a chainsaw and start cutting down everything. But if your goal is to really bring biodiversity to your yard, I would start adding more productive plants that belong there. And if you run out of space, then maybe take one or two down.
But it's also, we also know, especially here in California, you know, it's a judgment call that also has to pull into account things like those trees may often provide much needed shade. They help, if there's enough of them, they will help to reduce heat island effects. And so they have other benefits besides supporting the food web. So, you know, I would definitely recommend really considering carefully the cost benefits to tree removal. Another question that's come up quite a bit is we have a lot of succulents that grow here in California. To the best of my knowledge, succulents don't support caterpillars. Is that right, Doug, or do you know much about that?
I don't know of any that are on there. You know, there's always an exception. So I bet you there's a caterpillar somewhere that eats a succulent. But if you're trying to really support the food web, it's probably not going to happen through succulents. But it can help create that ground cover that improves the survivorship of caterpillars that are in canopy trees.
Is there a reference book you'd recommend besides, you know, going to online resources? Is there any books that you recommend for folks just starting out on this food web type of work?
You mean to find the plants to support the caterpillars?
Yeah.
You know, Dave Wagner is working on caterpillars of Western US, and he has been for over 10 years. And when he publishes it, that will be your reference book. And every time I see him, I bug him to get it out there. He says he's never going to finish because there's so many species, but he's got so many species already done. I'd love to see him get it out there. And then you'll have pictures with the host plant, and you know, it'd be a great resource. Other than that, your Calscape is telling you, look, the Fremont cottonwood has 134 species, and then you can see what those species are. It's a great resource. So that Calscape right now probably provides the easiest access to that information.
Another question that I thought was really interesting, because it gets at sort of two sides of the conservation and land protection coin. And, you know, obviously we have our world famous iconic monarch butterflies, which are really struggling right now, although they've started to make a tiny bit of a comeback. Clearly, there's things out there that are eating them. How do we think about cultivating landscapes that will increase the population of monarch butterflies, but without creating a buffet for everyone that likes to eat them? Or is that something that, you know, just do it enough and you'll hit a balance?
I wouldn't worry about having too many monarchs so that they're all going to get eaten. You are down 99% of the monarchs that used to be there. And it's because the milkweeds have largely been removed from the landscape, and the nectar plants. They need the reproductive plants and the forage. Now, of course, you know, the wildfires and the climate change, that's not helping them either. The monarch's not going to survive any of that stuff. So it's all this stuff put together. The only thing you can do as a general public is get those milkweeds and blooming plants back into your landscape everywhere. You've got your Central Valley there, which is so heavily slanted towards agriculture, where there's nothing on the ground except the almonds and the other things that are growing. Get some forage plants back in there, and the monarchs will do the very best they can to rebound. There's one advantage you have over the eastern monarchs, which have to fly to Mexico to overwinter. where the Mexican mafia is chopping down their overwintering site. You don't have that problem. You know, all your monarchs are in California on both ends. If you get the food plants back, they ought to be able to respawn. Well,
I think we've kind of reached the end of the range of questions that I think we have in front of us. I mean, there's certainly some technical questions that I think will probably be more accurately found in local web resources and in local books, and we'll try to put some of that information on our website. I'd like just to take one more time to thank you again, Doug, for taking the time out. I know it's getting late back there in the East Coast, so thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your wonderful work and your leadership in helping us, one person, 1 yard at a time, turning our country back into the raucous paradise of diverse life.
That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? You are quite welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks and good night. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.